Yes, it's time now for the big question. Tonight we're following up that stunning and devastating GB News investigation into the Grooming Gangs scandal, which saw thousands of vulnerable young women exploited, sexually assaulted and abused by gangs across the country. So, have the lessons of these appalling crimes been learned? To discuss this, I'm delighted to welcome Charlie Peters, who made the film for GB News, and former Greater Manchester Police Detective and Grooming Gangs whistleblower Maggie Oliver. A privilege to have both of you on the show. Charlie, can I start with you? Congratulate you on an important film. Why did you make it?
I made this film because we've never had a national conversation about this issue. When the lid blew off this scandal a decade ago, our response was very mealy-mouthed. We dealt with it full of political correctness, I felt, and I was rather stunned, 10 years on, that survivors were not being heard. The responses that we needed to see from government, police, the media, the law, social services, everyone, I felt was lacking. I thought the only way to really turn this around was to try again with some fresh thinking, some fresh analysis, and to ensure people knew that this crisis is still going on today.
Absolutely. I'll come to Maggie in just a moment. I think you've got some key statistics about the scale of these crimes and the fact that they are ongoing.
Well, a GB News exclusive tonight we've taken from the Maggie Oliver Foundation, their most recent review of the vital and necessary work they are doing. The average age for the start of abuse that of survivors they encounter is just 12 years old. We've also found...
That's not the starting age, that's the average age.
Yeah.
Shocking.
And we've also found that there are currently more than 50 live or ongoing cases that the Maggie Oliver Foundation is supporting. I have to stress, this is just one charity covering the national picture. The real figure is likely much higher. We also found that the Maggie Oliver Foundation is dealing with more than 500 survivors being supported in last year alone. And finally, since 2020, more than 1,000 survivors of child sexual abuse and exploitation have come to the Foundation for support since 2020. Now, these are extraordinary figures, and clearly it shows the lessons of the past have not been learned, and survivors are still seeking support, from legal support to emotional support, and I think we're very, very lucky to have someone like Maggie joining us to deal with this today.
Well, we are, and Maggie, I'm humbled to have you on the show. You've been such an important voice for the victims and helping them pursue justice and lock up the evil criminals that committed these crimes. Maggie, those figures we've just heard, that's the tip of the iceberg, isn't it? We'll never have a full sense of the scale of what's happened.
We won't, Mark, but every one of those numbers is a life destroyed. I think Charlie's done an amazing job, actually, Charlie, with that documentary. I think you've pulled together a lot of the information that was needed. I set up the Maggie Oliver Foundation about 3 years ago because the authorities were not, and still are not, dealing with this crime properly. They were not gathering the statistics. They weren't gathering the information. I have now gathered a really good team around me. We've built our own system, and we are collecting the evidence that the government and the politicians don't want people to know. And, Charlie's referred to the fact that racism has been linked to this kind of crime. But for me, this is about child protection. And if we don't face this head on, the losers in every case is child or a young woman who has their whole life destroyed. And, 55% of the cases on our system since 2020 have got an element of sexual exploitation to them. And the victims who come to us only come to us because they have been failed and are being dismissed by the police and the authorities when they go to them in desperation for help. Many of them are being criminalised. They are being blamed still for their own abuse and pushed away. And I am not blaming individual police officers. There are good and bad in every profession. And yes, there are some poor police officers, but there are some very good ones. But the solution to ending this horrendous abuse has to come from the top. And by the top, I mean the government and chief constables and those in positions of authority. They know what is going on. It is a very time-consuming, expensive and resource-intensive investigation to prosecute these gangs because they are now so sophisticated, they are so experience in picking out vulnerability in their victims. And those victims who are selected find themselves lacking, and even when they go to the police, there is very little appetite to investigate these crimes. They are not protected efficiently. And the gangs use increasingly sophisticated means of threatening these children. You know, on Snapchat and on messaging, they take photographs of them because, as Charlie's highlighted, you know, it still is they befriend them, they become a boyfriend, they think they're in a relationship. Often one of these children will send photographs to their abuser. That photograph then becomes a means of threatening and blackmailing and frightening those children. Because, you know, we had a case recently of a little girl of 11 who had sent photographs to her boyfriend. He then threatened to send them to her parents. Her father contacted the police. Police officers turned up into the home address, walked straight up to this little girl who was mortified and basically said to her, look, do you know that you have committed criminal offences by sending those photographs on your phone? But if you don't say anything more about it, delete your messages, delete your computer, we won't do anything else about it. And the father rightly came to the foundation in absolute disgust, because behind that man threatening that girl is another gang, and there will be many, many other victims. And the police need to act when they are faced with information like that. And far too often, they don't. And I would like to just say, Mark, that if there are any victims or survivors listening now who feel that they are on their own, throughout the whole country, we are a small national charity. Come to us and we will help you be heard. And we have had success. Obviously, I resigned about Rochdale, but I worked on Augusta. And we have recently supported, I think it's 7 victims in Hull, where Hull police had closed down that investigation, saying there was insufficient evidence to do anything. We supported them, advocated for them, and almost a year and a half later, that case has now been reopened. So things can be done, but it shouldn't need an organisation like us to fight for them. It just fills me with horror, Mark, still. It's taken over my life, but I'm not on my own now. I have a wonderful team at the foundation, and we are doing some amazing work in helping these young women put their lives back together. We listen to them. We don't judge them, we communicate, we treat them with empathy, with kindness, and it isn't always about a prosecution, because as a former police officer, I know it is impossible to prosecute every man who rapes a child. If the evidence isn't there, it doesn't go to court. But the way that woman or young man is treated by the system will impact on their life for the rest of their life. But with the right care and the right treatment and the right conversations, that victim can recover, and we are helping them to recover.
Indeed, I'll ask producer Stephen to give me the details of your organisation, your foundation, before we conclude this conversation. Charlie, was this a case, in terms of the police and local authorities, was it a case of cover-up, was it incompetence or denial?
Well, we still don't know the full picture. No, we went to several towns as we conducted this year-long investigation. But through our reporting and investigation across the country, we found up to 50 different towns and cities, as shown by a map during the documentary, where there have been credible allegations of grooming gangs. Now, in several of those towns, it's clear that cover-ups did happen. But a lot of the time, it was ignorance and incompetence that also ruled the way. As Maggie has pointed out, oftentimes there are good police officers and there are bad police officers, but they're also just people who aren't capable of doing their job, and they need additional support, they need training, and they need guidance. The reason why the national response to this crisis is so absolutely vital is because we need new powers to give to the good police officers so they can carry out the appropriate job. And we also need to empower those in local authorities to have mandatory reporting, so that when people hear about cases of CSA or CSE, they are required to report it. Because all too often, as we found in many of these historic cases, many of these most shocking scandals, people heard about abuse, did not pass it on. They did not take actions. Indeed, GB News Investigates has uncovered several instances in the last 2 months where people who failed in that most vital duty are still working in the public sector today. So that is absolutely vital. Accountability must also be delivered. So if you do fail so extremely at this level in the government or in the police or in law, you should not continue that role. You should not work in the public sector again. In many ways, you should be ostracised for this gross failure. But unfortunately, as we found, that is often not the case.
Finally, Maggie, can I ask you a simple question? Has justice been done?
Not until every one of these abusers is in prison. And what I would like to say, Mark, before I finish, is a very quick point, that we are trying to build relationships with police forces. We are actually the best friend of the police, because we are not the investigators, but we are taking these cases to the police when we feel that there is a case to answer and a victim has been fobbed off. But we are a small national charity. We rely on public funding. We are not a national institution. And you know what? We don't want money from the police or the government, because I want to retain our independent voice to call out these failures where they occur. And if somebody gives us money in exchange for silence, it would never work. This is about the truth. It is about sharing the victims' voices. They tell us their stories and we fight on their behalf. We advocate for them. They are not on their own, and we will not go away until every single victim who reports a rape is prosecuted where the evidence exists. And if the evidence doesn't exist, they must be treated humanely, with decency, with compassion, with care, and they should be protected. And I know I sound emotional, but that's because I am.
Maggie, in giving those victims a voice, you have been truly heroic. I want to thank you for joining us on the programme. I want to thank you for the work you've done, and also I want to congratulate Charlie Peters for a very important film, a GB News documentary. So thanks to Charlie Peters, thanks to former Greater Manchester Police Detective Constable and Rochdale child abuse whistleblower Maggie Oliver. If you'd like to contact Maggie's organisation, or if you can spare £1 or two, I'm certainly going to be sharing a few shillings with that great organisation when I get off air. It's the Maggie Oliver Foundation.com, the Maggie Oliver Foundation.com. Great work they do. Now, this GB News exclusive documentary, Grooming Gangs, Britain's Shame, is available to watch right now on the GB News YouTube channel. And of course, you'll be able to catch it on the app as well.